So how long can a lawnmower last without any kind of maintenance done to it? Apparently some mowers from a decent brand can last for quite a while, but eventually it's going to catch up with you and something unwanted is going to happen and ruin your day and maybe even your summer. Today we're going to try and keep that from happening, but it might be more than most consumers would want to do. Because as you're about to see, there's quite a bit of stuff we need to do, and it's not going to be fun either. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Snapper branded lawnmower, and the problem is that it's been several years, and as far as anyone knows, it's never had any maintenance work done to it. And to be honest, I'm quite surprised it lasted this long with very little done to it, but it certainly seems like it can be done. Now, I'm going to try and repair this lawnmower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. I will let you know that this mower does start and run. It does not have a problem with it as far as I know. That's the main problem with doing any kind of maintenance work. You basically have to take a perfectly good machine out of rotation so that you can do unnecessary work to it. Now, maintenance work is seen to be extra work that doesn't fix a problem, but it does help to keep a problem from happening in the future. Now, surprisingly, the oil looks to be in pretty good condition. That tells me someone within the last year or two has changed the oil, which is great news for the engine. Too bad I can't say the same for the air filter, which looks to be the original one based on how packed it is with dirt and grass. I know I'm going to get some comments about this, but for right now, I'm going to put this air filter back in. That way we can see how the engine was running with it looking like this. So it's been running for about 5 minutes and it should be pretty close to normal operating temperature. Let's try and start it again and see how it does. So it did take 3 pulls to start it when cold, but it was a lot easier to start when it was hot. That tells me that more than likely the valve clearances are out of tolerance and will need to be inspected. So how long should it take for the valve clearances to get out of tolerance then? Well, it really depends on how old the mower is. Now, this mower was built 8 years ago, which is much too long between inspections. And from experience, a yearly checkup is much too soon, and even every other year is not needed either. So it really depends on how much the mower is used each season, but the sweet spot is something around the 4 to 5 year mark. I know some would say that's too much time between inspections, but as shown by this engine, 8 years of no inspections and it's starting and running well enough for most consumers. This does bring up a debate about how well a mower should start and run though. So from conversations I've had with buyers, customers, and even some viewers, even if it takes several pulls to start a mower, most seem to be okay with it just so long as it starts. Most don't seem to care that it starts with a single or even 2 pulls of the rope, which is kind of interesting. The reason why is because if a mower takes more than a couple of pulls to start, it typically means something's wrong with it. Now, this is from my perspective and yours might be different, and I'm perfectly fine with it. But I will let the customers know that there is something going on with their mower because it's not behaving the way that it should. Now, most of the owners are more concerned about the cost of an inspection and repair, and they're unwilling to part with more money, which is understandable. But 99% of the time, I don't charge extra for doing a little bit more labor, at which point most agree for me to check on the problem. Unfortunately, this is the toughest part of doing maintenance work, and that is having to explain that even though there's nothing wrong with the machine, we need to look at it even further to see if there might be something wrong with it, which makes it seem like we're looking for stuff to charge them for. And if the owner says they don't want me to look into the issue anymore, well, there's really nothing else I can do but listen to them. I mean, it is their stuff. Now, to be quite honest, this mower was not that dirty to begin with, which is very surprising. This tells me that they either seem to care a lot about it or they haven't used it that much since buying it new. Now, after giving this mower a very quick shower, we need to let it dry in the sun for a bit before we start to work on it. And that's when I noticed what kind of condition this mower was really in. If I had seen this mower like this the first time, I would have said it was only a year old. Next, we're going to take out the spark plug from the engine so 1, we can inspect it, and 2, because it'll make rotating the engine a lot easier when we check the valve clearances. So this spark plug looks pretty good considering its age. The only issue that I have is that it's not the one that comes from the factory for this engine. It is, however, the equivalent spark plug from the Autolite brand, so there's no concern there. I just prefer using the OEM plug instead. Now the air gap for the ground is right where I like it to be, but you're welcome to set it to whatever number you think it should be. Next up, we're going to take off the valve cover to expose the rocker arms so that we can inspect the clearances that will more than likely be out of tolerance. We then need to rotate the engine so that one of the arms is all the way down, while the other one we're going to check will be the loose one. We then need to get out a 5/1000 of an inch feeler to see how it fits in the clearance between the arm and the top of the valve stem. What we find is that it's much too loose, meaning the clearance here is bigger than the feeler gauge and needs to be adjusted. But for my information, I would like to see how much it's grown to, which turns out to be about 8/1000 of an inch. We could adjust the clearance now, but instead, I'm going to rotate the engine so we can check the clearance for the other arm. The strange part is that it too was out of tolerance by the same amount, which doesn't happen very often. So to make our adjustments, we'll first loosen the adjusting nut and then turn out the jam bolt. The reason I loosen the nut instead of the jam bolt first is that there's less risk of breaking something doing it this way. I'll then slide the 5/1000 feeler gauge into the clearance, and while turning the nut clockwise, I'll then move the feeler in the clearance until it almost gets stuck. And if it does get stuck, just turn the nut counterclockwise a bit until it's loose again. Once the feeler just barely drags in the clearance, then turn the jam bolt to lock the adjusting nut in place. After that, double check that the feeler is how you want it to be, and then do the same process for the other arm. Of course, there are other ways you can make these adjustments if you don't have a spare arm, and that is to make the adjustment first and then check it afterwards. That way you don't have to worry about trying to keep the feeler gauge in the clearance while making the adjustments. The only problem with doing it this way is that you might end up making several attempts to set the clearance, but some might find this way a whole lot easier than the other way. I do have to let you know that checking the valve clearances is not without some hazards, one of which is the chance to cause an oil leak. Now, it doesn't happen all that often. In fact, I think I checked a dozen, if not more, clearances before I experienced my first leak. The only problem is that fixing it will either take a new valve cover gasket or the addition of some sort of gasket sealer to the old gasket, which is kind of iffy. And it'll be up to you to decide which of those choices you'd rather do, but one of the ways is a whole lot better than the other one. Now, even though this wheel is not stuck, we need to do some maintenance work to it to keep it working well, otherwise you risk damaging it, or worse yet, having the wheel get stuck. Once again, convincing the owner or even yourself to do this bit of maintenance is going to be tough since there's no obvious problem with it. And most times it takes a major problem with it before consumers will put the money into fixing it, which you can't blame them for. Now for this part, all we need to do is to clean up any buildup from the axle, then apply a lubricant to it before installing the wheel back on. Just be careful when cleaning the buildup on the axle. If you use sandpaper, make sure it's a fine grit, that way you don't damage the axle. I ended up using a well-used red Scotch-Brite pad, but you don't need to use the same thing. Now the non-driven wheels were already working extremely well, so I didn't feel the need to take them off to lubricate them. So at this point, we can start to put the mower back together, but there is one more very important thing that we need to do, and it's commonly overlooked, but it could have a terrible effect on the mower if it's not done. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about making sure that your blade is balanced. Just like making sure the wheels on your vehicle are balanced for a smooth ride down the highway, this is no different for the blade on your mower. Now you don't need to use anything fancy, just hanging the blade from a nail in the wall will work as well. But I do have to let you know that some tools work better than others, so make your choice as to which one you want to use. Also, make sure that you install the blade correctly on your mower, otherwise you won't be cutting the grass when you mow it, more like clubbing it to pieces instead. So there are only two more things we need to do before we try and start the engine, both of which are very important. The first item is of course to put the correct amount of oil back into the engine. Just be very careful and try not to put too much oil in the engine, otherwise with this type of oiling system, it'll do more harm than good. Now you can be just a bit over the full mark, but not by much, and if it is well over the full mark, you need to take a couple of ounces out. The last item to take care of is to replace that terrible looking air filter. Normally I wouldn't replace it until later on, but since I know the carb is not leaking, I don't have a problem replacing it right now. Now these air filters are not that expensive and could last a couple of years of service, and more if you clean them once a year, so it's well worth replacing it. So this time, it started with a rather single weak pull versus the 3 it needed the first time. Let's see if the hot start is still just as good as before. So as you just saw, it starts just as good hot as it does when it's cold, which is excellent news. Now, if you think inspecting and adjusting the valve clearances is something you do not want to tackle, I don't blame you at all. Some consumers would rather make extra pulls to start their mower than have to do all that work, and if you're okay with it, then be my guest. However, if you plan on selling that mower, hopefully the person who's considering buying it doesn't mind either. Now, as far as this project goes, all we had to invest besides the money for an air filter was a bit of time, carb cleaner, and some spray lube. Not a bad investment to make sure that it starts and runs the best it can for a couple more years before needing maintenance again. I will have to remind you that you do not have to do this kind of maintenance work very often, and as this mower has shown us, even at 8-year intervals, it's still holding up quite well. Although I would recommend a much shorter period because 8 years is pushing it. So my question is, how much time should there be between maintenance work like the stuff you saw me do with this one? 2, 3, or even more like 4 years. Remember, there is no wrong answer with this one.
Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.